Yeah. Hey, so now that we've kind of talked about the Fed and the bigger picture of what the money supply is, we're going to get into kind of two big problems that the Fed has to contend with when creating policies to impact the U.S. economy. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is inflation. So Fed ends up having to fight inflation in an infinite game, which means that like there is no winning. The whole point of the game is to just keep playing because we'll get to it very quickly. But basically, inflation is a never ending issue for the Fed and us. And you know, to have negative inflation is also a bad thing. I'm getting ahead of myself. Here we go. So inflation, basic definition. It means that prices go up across the entire economy over time. This means that like things that were expensive or things that an example of inflation is a movie ticket. Can you think about right now? I mean, not right now because movie theaters are closed. God, this is a depressing example. Okay, but before all the movie theaters closed, how much was a movie ticket? Right, like somewhere between 18 and like $25. I know that there are movies that are or ticket movie theaters that have cheaper tickets, but they don't have the big comfy chairs, and honestly, that's what I'm paying for. So, right now, if you were to go see, or like last year, did you go see Star Wars? Because I did, and I paid $25 a human to go see the last of the Skywalker movies. Yep, yeah, it happened. I paid $25 to go see the final Star Wars. I mean, I know it's not the last Star Wars, but like the end of the saga. Oh my God, this is running on forever. Here we go. This is so much easier in class. In 1999, I saw episode 1 of that Star Wars saga, not A New Hope. I wasn't alive in the 70s, but in 99 I was, and I went and I saw the episode 1, and I loved it because I was like 12. How much was the ticket? I mean, I saw two Star Wars movies, arguably the same amount of Star Wars. In 1999, one ticket for a Star Wars movie was $3.25. In 2019, one ticket for a Star Wars movie was $25. Prices over time go up. This is why all the old people in your life tell you when they were your age, things were considerably cheaper. It's not just, it'll happen to you too. One day you'll get older and you'll remember when gas only cost $4 a gallon, and then you'll tell everybody about it because apparently that's just something we do as we get older. Look at me, I'm doing it right now with movie tickets. Hooray! Okay. So one of the issues with measuring inflation is that some things change price drastically, like movie tickets, and other things don't change price that much because in, let's see, 2005 when I started driving, gas cost about $3 a gallon. Gas does not currently cost $25 a gallon, which means that over about the same period of time, we've seen the prices of two different products change at a pretty different rate. And so one of the difficulties in measuring inflation is how do you get kind of a general understanding of not one specific item, but kind of all of the economy and how prices are changing overall. And so in order to do that, economists use what's called a price level. A price level is an average of prices or goods throughout an economy. Sometimes you have a price level within a specific market. Sometimes, more often, you have a price level that tries to go across as many markets within the economy that is feasible to be measured. Again, this is an approximation. It's not like an exact number, but we have an entire branch of the government. If you love statistics, you could go work for them. An entire branch of the government where their whole job is to look at labor and statistics, or look at the statistics of labor and prices and inflation factors into that. And so they use a specific price level called the Consumer Price Index. And in the Consumer Price Index, they monitor a typical list of goods that the average American has to spend their money on. Go ahead and see if you can guess 3 things that you think would be in a typical list of things Americans have to spend money on. So here we have a graph illustrating what actually falls into the CPI. And so the number, like the largest part of that basket is housing, because rent and mortgages tend to be what most Americans spend most of their money on. From there, we have things like transportation, to food, to healthcare, to education, all the way down to apparel. Less than 3% of CPI focuses on the cost of clothes, but that is something that they keep track of. And they're not necessarily looking for like, you know, the cost of designer. They're looking at the cost of like an average t-shirt. A lot of this is dealing with statistical averages and kind of trying to find that middle ground. If we don't want to believe that inflation is real, that's fine, because I can prove that it exists, because economists came up with an equation that shows that the more money you have in an economy, the higher prices are, which is what gets called the quantity theory of money. This is what proves that inflation is not just old people feeling nostalgic about a time when things were cheaper, but actual factual truth. So there is a direct relationship between the amount of money in the economy and how much things cost. So the more money that there is in the economy, the more prices, the higher the prices will be. And this is the basis, like this truth is the basis of all of the monetary policy that our government comes up with. If it is ever proven that the quantity theory of money is actually flawed and not true, then all of our monetary policy has been built on a lie. But it's true, so we're fine. And so this is the equation that proves inflation. I want you to use all of your equation knowledge to take a guess right now. What do you think each of these letters stands for? Great. So M is for money. V is for velocity. I guess if you studied physics, you're real happy right now. And velocity means the amount of times that money changes hands over a period of time. So how often that dollar, if you were to like actually put a tracker on a dollar and watch how it went from like one person to the store, from the store to the bank, from the bank to the next person, from that person to a store, from that store to another store, from that store to a person, right? Like if you were looking at how often money changes hands. And that is equal to the current prices, so the price level, the averaging of prices across a variety of markets, times just how much stuff gets produced. But having 2 P's in an equation apparently isn't okay for maths reasons, so they had to call the second P transactions, even though it actually stands for production. So money times velocity equals to the amount that things cost times how much stuff gets produced. Let's take a look at that. So we're going to, again, work with the world's smallest economy here, much like we had the world's smallest bank earlier. This economy has a whole $10 in it, and that's where our M is. And that $10 is going to exchange hands twice. So, like, I'm going to give you $10. Here you go. And then can I have that $10 back? Thanks so much. Congratulations. We're the world's smallest economy. Is real exciting for us. And that's going to be equal to the amount of things produced. Apparently, you gave me something in exchange for this $10. I don't know what it was, but I bought whatever you were selling. And then likewise, you bought whatever I was selling when you handed that $10 back. So we had 2 items produced, either goods or services. So we're going to try to figure out what is the average price of that good or service within our really tiny economy. And if we solve the equation MV equals PT, we find out that the price level is 10. The average cost of goods within our economy is 10. So quantity theory of money says that if we increase the amount of money that we have within our economy, prices will go up. Let's see if that's true. If we increase the amount of money to 20, oh, look at that, prices also increase to 20. And this is called inflation, or prices getting higher over time. If we were looking at decreasing the amount of money, this can go the other way. So if for whatever reason we were going to take a lot of money out of the economy and we now have a much smaller money supply, you would also notice that prices shrink as well. This is called deflation. So inflation is something that happens over time and is kind of impossible to avoid. But when it happens slowly, it's okay because people have time to adjust. When it happens rapidly, things get bad fast. So you're going to have to do some thinking here. Let's say that there is an annual inflation rate of 100%, which means that every year prices double. So what cost, $1 on this day in this year, on the same day in the next year would cost $2. Not super bad if we're looking at small amounts, but if we look at like your rent doubling over the course of a year, it's not great. How would prices doubling within a year impact your life? What kinds of things do you think you would stop buying? What kinds of things do you think you would have to prioritize buying? How would inflation impact what you get to do? What if prices, instead of doubling every year, doubled every day? So, oh my God, I've got here we go. Ready? We've got this really adorable Eeyore stuffed animal. He's got a little Velcro tail because he's Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. We bought this at Disneyland. Do you think that if its price went from, gosh, I don't remember how much we spent on it. Let's say it was $10. It's conservative. If this was $10 on Monday and $20 on Tuesday and $40 on Wednesday and then $80 on Thursday and then $160 by Friday, do you think anyone's buying this by Friday? Do you think that their money is going to have to be spent on something else? What would happen to your savings account? Because it doesn't double in size. Think about all the money that you have in the bank. How much would how would prices doubling every day impact the amount of things you can buy, the types of things you would buy? And when we're talking about prices doubling literally every day, that's not like it's never happened, oh my gosh, worst case scenario. That's 2008 in Zimbabwe, where Zimbabwe hit a peak monthly inflation of, I think, 80 trillion, if I can read that number right, which is insane. And at that point, basically, people lose all their faith in their money. Because can you imagine the cost of college if prices doubled every single day? It doesn't matter if your parents have been saving since before you were born. There's no way that your savings account is prepared for college to get the exponentially more expensive. And when we see inflation reach higher than 500%, which is pretty aggressive, we call that hyperinflation. You might have studied hyperinflation before when you looked at post-World War I Germany, but there's a bunch of points in history where we can look at economies that have hit peak hyperinflation. And an interesting commonality between these economies is they don't go back to using the currency that they did during the hyperinflation. So Zimbabwe ends up having to walk away from its own currency and they start using the US dollar, because at least the US dollar in 2008 was steady. Deflation, if we didn't catch it from our example on the slide before, is when prices go down over time. And this is often combined with really deep recessions or depressions, or when you have your economy just shrinking in size. So why would inflation drop during a recession? Why would prices go down when the economy is slowing down? And then the last term we're going to hit with inflation is one called stagflation. This is where you have high inflation combined with a recession, and that's a horrible combination that ultimately makes it so that people can't buy anything, and so demand drops, and when demand drops, supply chains drop, and we end up with what would almost always turn into a depression. So if we look at this beautiful image of the world, we can see all of the countries color-coded based on their inflation rate. So I want you to go ahead and take a minute before we get into actually calculating inflation rate and look at these countries, and then take your understanding or your knowledge of kind of global economics to figure out what can we conclude about inflation based on these countries. If you just said something along the lines of there's a Goldilocks zone of inflation where too little inflation is a bad thing and too much inflation is also a bad thing, and you want to be not too cold, not too hot, but just right, you hit the nail on the head. Because the reality is too little inflation means your economy is shrinking, and that's not a good thing. And too much inflation means your economy is growing out of control, and prices will soon grow so large that people can't keep up with them. That's also super bad, which means that you actually want your inflation to be growing, but growing slowly. Prices can go up over time. You just don't want them to go up over a short period of time. And prices going down, not actually as nice as it sounds. So economists use the Consumer Price Index to calculate the inflation rate. They take the price level and look at it, how it's changed from one point over another. So this is the equation that I will never ask you to solve. But if you're interested in how do you actually figure out when people say 3% inflation, what are they doing? They're taking that average basket of goods from across the entire US economy, and they're looking at how much did that average basket cost in 1999, and how much does that average basket cost today? And then they're subtracting for the difference and dividing by the original year. And then they multiply that by 100 to get a percentage, but they'll end up with a number that hopefully is around 2%. The inflation rate is a key indicator of how our economy is doing. It's kind of like taking the temperature of the economy. If the inflation rate starts to change and we end up looking at 4 to 5 to 8% inflation, our economy might be growing a little bit too quickly to be stable. If we see our inflation rate hitting 1% or even 0%, sometimes going into the negative, then we're looking at our economy slowing down way too much, and it might need some stimulation. The Fed uses this thermometer of inflation to figure out what does it need to do and adjust the amount of money that we have in circulation within our economy to either speed up the economy or slow it down. Oh man, okay. This is going to be confusing, and that's okay. You don't need to become an expert in this. You just need to have a basic awareness of how the Fed can speed up and slow down the economy. The way that the Fed really involves itself in our economy is through something called open market operations. If the Fed wants to increase the money supply, it has to go through a couple of options. It could throw the money back out of the back of an armored truck, like that would get cash into the economy. It might cause, a chaotic, oh God, can you imagine if there was just money floating on the 405? Like there would be so much, not only traffic, but chaos. It would not be great. There's got to be a safer way to do it. They could distribute the money to every bank equally and make sure that every bank gets the same amount of money, but that's not going to be great because a small regional bank in Asheville, North Carolina versus a really big nationwide bank, they don't need the same amount of money. But who gets to determine how much money the banks needs ends up becoming a really difficult thing. And so rather than having a government agency in charge of figuring out who gets what amount, we let the free market decide. And so open market operations is the buying and selling of government-backed securities in order to increase or decrease the amount of money in the economy. The Fed usually uses bonds as government-backed securities, which is a paper IOU that will eventually turn back into money. And you went over bonds last week, but just a quick reminder that the buyer of a bond is lending money to the seller, kind of like a loan, but it's not the same thing. And the Fed uses bonds for two key reasons. The first being that people who are buying bonds tend to be banks. So we'll see investment and commercial banks buying bonds from the government in order to get money into their banks or to, give money to the federal government and slow down the economy. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But it gets the money directly to the loanable funds market, which is great because the loanable funds market, aka banks, is where people go to when they need to borrow money. And so it's an easy way to contract or grow the money supply. The other reason that the Fed usually goes with bonds is because if they were to use something else, like bagels, if the Fed were to use bagels, like they were like, let's go buy a whole bunch of government-backed securities, we're going to invest in bagels. The Fed buys 20 million, at like a normal day of open market operations is around $20 billion. Can you imagine if the Fed tried to buy $20 billion worth of bagels? Every baker out there would be like rolling up their sleeves, like getting ready, because this was going to be the like rocky moment for them to be, I don't know, this joke doesn't work. In a classroom is fine, but this is real weird, so we're just going to bail there. Know that there's some sort of Rocky Bagel Baker montage in my brain happening right now, and maybe in yours too. But the other reason is that if the Fed wanted to buy $20 billion worth of something, and then you also wanted to buy, let's say like $1 worth of something, who is the seller going to go with? They're going to prioritize selling to the Fed, which is really going to disrupt kind of the consumer's ability to engage with that market. So, oh, look at that. I've used bagels so consistently. Here we go. If something is bagels, it might disrupt the supply and demand for the market, which would create longer impacts. Bonds, however, government-backed, pretty easy to control and work fairly well. So quantitative easing is a way of using open market operations to not just buy bonds, but buy something really specific in order to inject money into a very specific part of the economy. In 2008, with the housing crisis, when the value of houses fell drastically, the Fed used open market operations to inject money directly into the housing market, specifically targeting loans and mortgages rather than just going with general bonds, because they wanted to make sure that the money that they were putting into the economy went into the places where everyone thought there was money, and then it turns out that there actually wasn't. So in 2008, the Fed bought $1.2 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities, which were basically a bunch of mortgages stacked together. Some of them people were still paying, others were just people unable to pay back those mortgages, and then they were kind of worthless houses. And they also sold bonds. And in 2008, in like one day, a couple days, over the course of a month and a half, they injected nearly $2 trillion of money into the economy. The money supply expanded by $2 trillion. Now, what does the quantity theory of money tell us should happen next? If you expand the amount of money in an economy, what should have happened to prices? Do you remember 2008? Were you aware of money in 2008? Do you remember when everything just like quadrupled in price? Oh, that didn't happen? Yeah, it didn't happen because in this case, the money that was injected into the economy was already presumed to be there, because a lot of these houses, the loans that had been taken out on them, the prices of the houses were really high. And so people thought that when they were buying a house that it was worth that much. Turns out that the loan that they took out and the money they were trying to pay back for the house, nobody else was willing to buy the house for that much, and therefore that the actual demand of the house fell, and then the price of the house fell, but you still owed all that money to the banks. And so when the government started buying up those mortgages and injecting money into the economy, they just kind of filled a gap that was already there and made it real so that our economy didn't crash. I mean, it did. We ended up having a recession, although it was a shorter recession than it could have been had quantitative easing not worked. When the Fed uses quantitative easing, they're trying to do a couple of things by putting money into the economy. The first is that they're looking for maximum employment. They're trying to make sure that anyone who wants a job is able to find a job. Next, they're trying to make sure that people who need money can borrow it to start new businesses or buy a home or invest within the economy. It also makes sure that banks have the money that they need to create those loans, so that banks can lend people money for cars or for mortgages or for small businesses. And it makes sure that the economy continues functioning as it encourages people to spend money at a time where people might be nervous about spending money. Like right now, people are nervous about spending money because we're stuck in our houses and we don't know what happens next year. Some people have started to lose their jobs. Like 16 million Americans have started to lose their jobs, and people are starting to get nervous about spending money. But if we stop spending money, what's going to happen to more people? They're also going to lose their jobs. And so how do you get people to spend money? You give them money, and then we spend it, because that's what Americans do. Some of the things to be aware of, some risks with quantitative easing, is that you are increasing the money supply. And if you're doing it rashly, you will see inflation. And so if we see inflation and the value of the dollar changes too rapidly, then we see people not as willing to trade with us, because if you're trying to buy something from another country and it's worth $10 one week and then it costs $100 the next week, you're probably not going to use them as a supply chain in your production, and you'll go find a country that has more stable pricing. We also see it has a problem that, like, when it hasing, yeah, me. There's a potential that when the government stops the quantitative easing, when they stop injecting money into the economy, that the economy will just revert back to the problem or the recession that it was going into anyway. That the only reason that it was looking healthy was because the government was propping it up with money. In the case of 2008, it actually didn't work out that way. Well, we'll see how it works out now. And then lastly, because it encourages lending and it encourages borrowing, it also encourages debt. And debt is risky, because owing people money and then not being able to pay them back can really destabilize our economy. So how does the Fed use tools to affect the economy? And there's the big important slide. So in an expansionary policy is when the Fed is looking, or an easy money policy is when the Fed is looking to grow the economy. For whatever reason, the economy has started to slow down, and the Fed is looking to prevent a recession or a depression, so they will take a bunch of actions to try to increase the amount of spending and lending and interactions that the economy has. So the first thing, in open market operations, they'll buy bonds back. They'll buy the IOUs and turn those IOUs directly into cash. That cash will go out into the loanable funds market, because the banks are the bonds holders, and then the banks will take that money, they'll create loans, people will borrow, will buy stuff, the economy will improve. They also will decrease the reserve ratio. This used to be more common, but it hasn't been in the past, 2 decades or so, where the Fed will raise or lower the reserve rate. But since lowering the reserve rate to 10%, the Fed has just kind of held it there. But the Fed could even decrease that further, decrease the reserve rate down to 5%. And now banks everywhere have 5% more money that they could loan out. They could also change the discount rate. This is the interest rate that the Fed charges banks when banks take out loans from the Fed. If the discount rate is really low, like 0%, banks will see that as an opportunity to take out free money that they just have to pay back with no interest. That's ideal. And so if you're trying to get more people involved in the economy and you want to make loans as easy as possible, the Fed can lower the interest rates of loans that banks would take out with the Fed to near zero or zero, and encourage banks to take on debt with the Fed in order to interject more cash into the economy. In the short run, so not looking long term, but in the short run, these actions will increase the amount of employment. As small businesses take out loans, they hire new workers. As those new workers produce more stuff, as that new production gets sold on the economy, or gets sold in markets, we see our economy grow. But it's also increasing the amount of money that we have in our economy, which means we are going to see an increase in inflation, which, as long as it's held at a steady rate and it's not happening too quickly, means that our economy is growing in a healthy way. Now, if the Fed wanted to contract the economy, like take it smaller, if the economy was growing too fast and things were getting risky, the Fed basically can do the opposite of what it did in an easy money policy and to enact a tight money policy. So if we see risky bank lending, if we see people taking on a large amount of debt, if we see increased risky actions within the U.S. economy, the Fed might sell bonds. I've been doing this too long, my dog's giving up. So we might see them increase the amount that banks have to hold on to, reducing the amount of risk that banks are allowed to take on. They might increase the discount rate, thus discouraging Come here. Come here. Yeah. They might increase the discount rate, thus discouraging banks from taking out loans. And all of this in the short run will reduce production and lessen the need for workers. It might increase unemployment, but it will hopefully either stall or reduce inflation. So, if we're looking at the tools of the Fed, and they know how to increase the economy and they know how to slow the economy down, why is the Fed's job so hard? And that takes us to understanding how complex enacting policy actually is. And I guess that's where we're going to start the next video.